Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm really excited to bring you today's video. If you enjoy my content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Let's get started. On the morning of August 13th, 2013, the passengers took their seats on the Spanair MD-82 aircraft at Madrid Airport as preparations began for takeoff. The flight was heading towards the Canary Islands. In the early stages of the flight, everything appeared typical. The passengers had settled in their seats and safety instructions were given. Most passengers were traveling for vacation. Families, couples, and tourists were excited to spend the final days of summer in the Canary Islands. On this warm summer morning, the atmosphere on the plane was generally cheerful. Children sat by the windows, talking to each other, some watching the view outside. Many were excited about flying and hoped to relax during the few hours of travel. The flight crew continued with their duties, and the staff calmly went through the flight procedures. Everything seemed like a routine flight. For the first 15-20 minutes of the flight, it felt like an ordinary journey with no issues. The pilots had not encountered any problems since takeoff. The plane, which had taken off from Madrid Airport, was following a typical flight path. Meanwhile, some passengers, relieved of their flight anxieties, were reading books or playing games on their phones. The large MD-82 aircraft, with 154 passengers, was soaring into the sky, seemingly on a routine flight. But inside, the systems were beginning to experience a serious issue with one of the engines. Shortly after takeoff, about 12 minutes into the flight, the pilots realized something was going wrong. A malfunction occurred in one of the engines. Initially, the issue was considered a minor technical glitch, but it quickly became clear that the engine was not working properly and that the safety of the flight might be at risk. One of the MD-82's engines experienced an unexpected performance loss. While the plane was still airborne, the pilots were trying their best to stay calm, even though they were aware of the increasing threat. Although technical malfunctions like engine failures are rare, the pilots believed the situation was manageable. After all, such failures could sometimes be resolved quickly, and the plane could continue its normal flight path. However, when one engine fails, and that failure leads to problems with the other engine, things can quickly become more complicated. Meanwhile, the passengers aboard the aircraft were not overly concerned. The atmosphere remained mostly calm as the flight continued. As the plane headed towards the Canary Islands, passengers began to notice that the cheerful atmosphere was slowly changing. The flight crew, although still composed, seemed a little more serious in their discussions. The pilots were aware that the best course of action was to continue the flight safely, but the issue with the engine was growing more serious as time went on. The aircraft began to lose speed due to the engine failure. Most passengers didn't notice, but the cabin crew was aware of the situation and had received alerts. A few passengers felt a slight shaking, realizing that the pilots were assessing the situation. However, they still believed there was no emergency and that it was simply a technical malfunction. The pilots and crew worked carefully to maintain communication with passengers, reassuring them to stay calm. They assured everyone that everything was under control. However, as the plane continued to fly, things started to take a turn for the worse. Despite ongoing checks by the technical team, it became clear that the engine failure was worsening and that more time was needed to resolve the issue. This was actually the first step towards the tragedy. Within just a few minutes after takeoff, the aircraft had already encountered a serious danger. Most of the passengers, unaware of the severity of the situation, thought there was no danger other than some small shakes. The plane was still flying at a certain speed, and the pilots were in communication with air traffic control, planning for a normal landing. But this was merely an illusion, just a few minutes before the onset of the disaster. Soon, the engine would fail completely, and the plane would not be able to land, signaling the beginning of the catastrophe. Shortly after taking off from Madrid Airport, the plane began descending due to an engine failure. Initially, such technical issues were a familiar situation for the pilots and crew. Aircraft occasionally experience engine failures or mechanical malfunctions, but in most cases, these issues can be resolved quickly with professional intervention. Therefore, the pilots initially considered the problem to be a minor issue. However, this initial assessment would soon mark the beginning of a complex process that would lead to a series of further failures. When the flight crew first detected the engine failure, they tried to address the situation calmly. The calmness and professionalism of the crew played an important role in preventing the passengers from becoming concerned. However, the initial evaluation of the source and severity of the malfunction hindered the crew from taking the correct steps to ensure the flight's safety. The pilots believed the problem was temporary and attempted to reassure the passengers that everything was under control. The engine had begun to weaken significantly during the first 20 minutes of the flight. However, in such cases of engine failure, the aircraft could continue safely if the second engine was functioning properly. The MD-82 aircraft was equipped with 2 engines, and if both were operating correctly, the flight could continue safely. However, the effect of the malfunctioning engine became more apparent with each passing minute. This situation drew the pilot's attention, and a chain of errors regarding the control of the aircraft began to unfold. The pilots and crew initially did not fully grasp the seriousness of the technical issue. They were in communication with air traffic control, but initial analyses of the flight path revealed that the engine's weak performance was not sufficient for a safe landing. When air traffic control contacted the pilots, they initially thought they were on an appropriate descent path. However, the decrease in speed, altitude loss, and imbalance in the engines indicated that the conditions for a safe landing were not being met. The pilots quickly began searching for solutions to safely guide the aircraft. However, the current situation had created a complex technical failure chain. Despite tests and maintenance attempts, the problem appeared to be under control at first. But as time passed, the actual issue became more complex. The belief that the engine failure was temporary and that the flight could continue soon gave way to a more serious concern. The aircraft was beginning to deviate from its planned path, and the pilots were facing increasing challenges with each passing minute. The technical team provided some solutions after conducting inspections on the aircraft. The interventions on the engine aimed to restore the necessary speed and altitude for the aircraft to land. However, during tests conducted by the pilots, it became clear that things were not going as planned. Despite all the correction efforts, the engine still wasn't functioning properly. The inability of the engine to generate enough power was a significant obstacle to the aircraft's control. As the engines failed to work properly, the aircraft began to lose its ability to maneuver. The pilots, trying to follow a descent path, gradually realized that they were losing control of the flight. The plane's movements as it approached the landing became dangerously shaky, and the sense of everything being under control quickly faded. At this point, the pilots realized the real danger, but time was running out and they were desperately trying to figure out the correct intervention methods. While continuing communication with air traffic control, the pilots began to sense the imminent danger that the flight was heading toward. However, the flight crew had not yet panicked and made an effort to stay calm. Meanwhile, the plane, attempting to descend, began to drop rapidly, but the loss of engine power led to an unexpected and dangerous situation. The aircraft was no longer descending steadily. Instead, it was descending erratically and losing control. Eventually, the flight crew began to accept the complexity of the situation and look for an escape route. However, it was too late. The technical failures and inadequate interventions had led to the loss of control over the aircraft. Unfortunately, the conditions required for a safe landing were no longer achievable. These technical issues, which endangered the lives of 154 people, were starting to turn into a tragic disaster due to a series of misunderstandings and inadequate interventions. Shortly after taking off from Madrid Airport, the plane encountered an unexpected situation due to an engine failure. Initially, the plane seemed to be operating normally, and the efforts of the pilots and crew to keep the passengers calm helped maintain a relaxed atmosphere in the cabin. However, as the engine failure worsened, everything began to change in the following minutes. Passengers gradually became aware of the plane's movements and the seriousness of the situation. The cheerful and relaxed atmosphere at the beginning of the flight slowly began to shift to anxiety and concern. Passengers, especially those who felt the vibrations and light shaking of the plane, started to sense that something was wrong. Some passengers continued to look out the window and enjoy the view without feeling anxious, but others began to feel uneasy and apprehensive. The cabin had grown quiet. Those who had been reading books, playing games on their phones, or chatting with others suddenly became tense, looking around to understand what was happening. They began to realize that the malfunction, which initially seemed like an ordinary issue, was actually a much more serious problem. The pilots were making every effort to fix the engine failure. However, with each passing minute, the technical problems were worsening. The pilots maintained constant communication with each other, attempting various maneuvers to prevent the plane from descending further. The interventions to maintain the plane's balance against air currents and prevent a loss of speed quickly became more complex with every maneuver. The engine still couldn't produce the required power, and the pilots' attempts to maneuver the aircraft were making the flight even more challenging. With every moment, the plane shook unexpectedly, and the pilots were struggling to maintain control. All of this was starting to strain the nerves of the passengers. The atmosphere inside the cabin was growing increasingly tense. Despite the calm and professional attitude of the cabin crew, some passengers were visibly uncomfortable, finding it hard to believe the flight was proceeding normally. As the plane shook lightly, some passengers' faces changed with visible worry. Children began to cry, and the elderly looked at each other in fear. A few passengers tightened their seatbelts and tensed up, as if expecting something to happen at any moment. The tension in the cabin was being managed by the flight crew's sense of duty, as they worked to maintain control. The flight attendants continued to stay calm and reassure the passengers. However, it was clear to everyone that something was wrong with the plane. The flight attendants, speaking carefully to prevent panic, assured the passengers that the flight was still under control. When they said, "Please stay in your seats and fasten your seatbelts, you can be sure that you are safe," the anxiety in the passengers' faces became even more pronounced. The tension inside the cabin increased, and each new jolt made the passengers more anxious. Some passengers began to feel a greater sense of worry, thinking that the landing was approaching. As the plane continued to shake, the tension in the cabin felt almost like a prelude to disaster. The plane was descending more rapidly and losing altitude quickly. Passengers hoped to hear more information from the crew, but the flight attendants continued to remain professional and make sure not to create panic. Although the cabin was usually calm under the management of the attendants, now there was an uncertainty that everyone could feel. The passengers could only hear the noise of the plane's engines and feel frequent vibrations, noticing that efforts were being made to regain control of the flight. The loss of the plane's balance had made the passengers even more uneasy. Some were terrified by the thought that they had never experienced something like this before, quietly sharing their concerns with each other. However, many others tried not to reflect their fear onto fellow passengers, silently waiting. The outside view was now very different from the earlier relaxed moments of the flight. The plane seemed to be flying in an uncontrolled manner, with turbulence in the air reinforcing the feeling that they were on the edge of disaster. The passengers were hanging on every word from the flight attendants, eager to hear more information. But the most frightening aspect was not that the plane remained calm and controlled, but that with each passing minute, it shook more violently, and the problem continued to worsen despite the pilot's maneuvers. The flight crew, always trying to stay calm, was doing everything they could to reassure the passengers. However, the tension inside the cabin felt like a harbinger of an impending disaster. Passengers began to realize that behind the calm demeanor of the crew, the pilots were doing everything they could, trying every maneuver possible to regain control of the situation. But each intervention was causing the plane to become more unstable, and the passengers' anxiety grew. The tension mounted, and that moment, perceived as the harbinger of a disaster, was pulling everyone inside the plane deeper into fear. At the beginning of the flight, everything seemed fine, but just a few hours later, the plane was speeding toward a tragedy that would change the lives of everyone on board. As the plane approached landing due to the engine failure, the tension in the cabin grew even more. As the crew tried to manage the situation, the technical issues became increasingly complex, and the sense of impending disaster spread throughout the plane. However, nothing had progressed so quickly to make the disaster seem so near and inevitable. When the moment arrived, no one could believe that such a great loss would occur. After a while, a major failure occurred in the plane's right engine. The pilots knew that engine failures were technical issues that needed to be solved, but the complete failure of the right engine took the situation to a whole new level. The plane was now trying to stay in the air with only one engine, and this engine was struggling to provide enough power, making it difficult to maintain control. The shakes and vibrations from earlier in the flight now felt like a warning of a disaster. On one side, the engine was not functioning, and on the other, the pilot's helplessness was causing the situation to worsen with each passing minute. The pilots began to make their final maneuvers in an attempt to control the plane and make a safe landing. They communicated with air traffic control to get guidance for an emergency landing route. The plane was descending rapidly, not gaining any further altitude, and every effort was being made to manage the situation. However, these maneuvers, rather than stabilizing the plane, resulted in increased instability due to the impact of the failure, and control was gradually slipping away. Passengers inside the cabin were trying to understand more of what was happening. The tremors from a few seconds ago had become sharper and more terrifying. There was a tense silence in the cabin. Even though the passengers could still see the crew's calm and cheerful demeanor, they began to realize that they had reached the brink of disaster. Every jolt in the plane now felt like a precursor to a tragic outcome. The pilots were engaged in an incredibly difficult battle to regain control of the plane. However, no matter how hard they tried, the engine failures and the loss of the necessary speed and altitude for landing made a safe landing impossible. At this point, the pilots and crew decided to initiate emergency procedures as a final effort. But with each passing second, it was becoming increasingly clear that disaster was imminent. As the plane descended rapidly, the pilots made a final attempt to correct their descent path for landing. However, all the aerial maneuvers were not enough to maintain the flight's balance. The moment the plane lost control, everything turned into a catastrophe in an instant. In a terrifying moment, the plane's control was completely lost, and the pilot's final efforts proved inadequate. The plane began descending rapidly toward the ground, crashing with a series of jolts and noises. That moment felt like an eternity in a matter of seconds. Everything happened in an instant, and within a few seconds the plane crashed to the ground, with a loud noise. All that was left behind was a thick cloud of dirt, the screeching of metal and smoke. Upon impact, a massive explosion sounded. Instantly, everything inside the plane was destroyed. The plane had shattered after crashing, at an incredible speed with multiple fires erupting. The passengers who had lived through that moment found themselves in the midst of a catastrophe, where everything seemed to come to an end. However, within the tragedy, there was also a miracle. In this great disaster, only one of the 154 passengers survived. This miraculous survival reflected the extraordinary situation of an 11-year-old child. The child's survival felt like a bittersweet consolation for the loss of the family sitting next to them, their relatives, and the other passengers on board. However, this miracle was also coupled with great pain and loss. The memory of the 154 lives lost in this tragic crash cast a shadow over the experiences of the child who survived. Most of the passengers lost their lives after the plane crashed to the ground. In the moments following the disaster, the only survivor, the child, went into a state of shock and trauma. Although he had miraculously survived, the immense tragedy left indelible marks on his life and on the lives of those left behind. This tragic event would remain a dark chapter in aviation history, and the fact that more precautions need to be taken to prevent such disasters would once again be brought to light. The Spanair MD-82 crash on August 13, 2013 became an unforgettable tragedy in aviation history. In this horrific disaster where 154 people lost their lives, a miracle occurred. An 11-year-old child managed to survive after the crash. That moment was not only a physical miracle but also a story of psychological and emotional survival. The child's family and relatives, along with the other passengers, had perished, but he had narrowly escaped death. This event sparked both immense sorrow and great curiosity around the world. The child's survival was scientifically explainable for some, but for others it was truly seen as a miracle. The fact that the only survivor was a child was unprecedented in the world. The miraculous survival of the child became the subject of news reports around the globe, turning him into a symbol filled with hope and the will to survive for many. While the child's family and all the other passengers had died, he was the only one to survive the crash. This situation raised many questions in people's minds. How did this child survive? Why was he the only one to survive? Many people saw the child's survival as a story to be told, a miracle. But behind this miraculous survival, was it just luck, or did certain biological factors also play a role? The child was quickly taken to the hospital right after the crash. However, upon arrival at the hospital, the extent of the trauma he had experienced became immediately apparent. Although there were no significant physical injuries, he was in shock and suffering from severe psychological trauma. Despite having no cuts or broken bones, the terrifying experience had left him under immense stress. Above all, he had lost his family and loved ones. These losses left permanent marks on the child's life. Almost every day he experienced nightmares, panic attacks, and emotional breakdowns, which were some of the main traumas that deeply affected his life. After the crash, he had to receive psychological help, and his recovery process took a long time. Many experts couldn't attribute the child's survival solely to luck. Some scientific explanations might suggest factors that played an important role in the child's survival. It is known that in airplane crashes, certain biological and physical factors can increase the chances of survival. The position of the seat where the child was sitting, the proper fastening of the seatbelt, and his body structure might have been significant factors that contributed to his survival. Additionally, younger children sometimes suffer less harm than adults in such crashes. The child's body may have adapted better to the severity of the crash and been more flexible to absorb the impact, which could explain his survival. However, despite all these factors, the fact that a child survived such a catastrophe was still regarded as a miracle by many. The child's survival, combined with the loss of his family and the trauma he had experienced, created an even heavier emotional burden in the days after the crash. His family had died in the accident. The child had been flying with them, but he was the only one to survive. This situation had a profound psychological impact on him. The sudden loss of his family, who constituted his entire world, left deep scars on his life. Immediately after the crash, the child was overwhelmed by a constant feeling of loss and guilt. Questions like, "Why me? Why not the others?" constantly echoed in his mind. Following the child's survival, news stories emerged in the media, particularly surrounding how this little boy had managed to survive while losing his family. Some people attributed his survival entirely to luck, while others described it as a miracle. The fact that a child, traumatized by the loss of his family, survived alone made him a symbol for those around him. People believed that the child's strong will to survive and determination were key factors in his survival. The world was filled with gratitude and respect for the child's survival. For many years, the psychological trauma experienced by the child who survived the crash continued to have an impact. The child's future was not tested physically but psychologically, facing great challenges. The psychological trauma and losses he endured became the biggest obstacles in his life. However, over time, he tried to overcome his traumas. People began to see how strong his character was at such a young age. As time passed, questions about his life began to be answered, but behind everything, there was something deeper. The child's survival meant much more than scientific explanations. For many, his survival was a miracle. And like every miracle, there was something behind it. Perhaps just hope, belief, and the will to live. Over time, the child's struggle to hold on to life after such a great loss was seen not only as survival, but as a process of starting to live again. As the only survivor, this little child's story gained great significance, both in his life and around the world. The Spanair MD-82 crash, which occurred on August 13, 2013, while flying from Madrid Airport in Spain to the Canary Islands, became one of the most unforgettable tragedies in aviation history, resulting in the deaths of 154 people. Shortly after takeoff, the plane went out of control due to a technical failure and crashed while attempting to land. However, the consequences of the crash were not limited to the magnitude of the disaster itself. The subsequent investigations revealed how inadequate flight safety and maintenance procedures were, and the crash led to significant changes in safety standards within the aviation industry. The first analyses after the crash determined that one of the plane's engines had experienced a serious failure. However, the failure to identify this issue in time and the inability of the flight crew to address it properly deepened the tragedy. Many experts noted that the errors leading to the crash occurred in a chain. The seemingly ordinary and normal operation at the beginning of the flight, combined with the emerging technical issues, led to a major disaster. Despite the first signs of engine failure, the flight crew continued their efforts to regain control. However, the mistakes made prevented a safe landing and ultimately caused the plane to crash. Comprehensive investigations after the crash revealed serious shortcomings in the aviation industry's maintenance and safety procedures. Particularly, some procedures related to aircraft maintenance were not applied correctly, creating a dangerous vulnerability in terms of flight safety. Additionally, it was determined that the flight crew's responses in crisis situations decreased the chances of survival for the plane and contributed to the escalation of the incident. As a result, after the crash, aviation authorities reviewed flight safety regulations and decided that maintenance processes needed stricter oversight. This crash taught important lessons to the aviation industry and led to major changes in the operational safety protocols of airlines. The 11-year-old child, the sole survivor, continued to attract attention after the crash. While the child's survival demonstrated that luck and biological factors played a role, many still regarded it as a miracle. In this horrific crash, where most of his family and the other passengers lost their lives, only this child survived. The discussions and writings after the incident emphasized that the child's survival had a psychological significance, as well as a physical one. His story showed that sometimes survival is more than just a scientific explanation. In certain situations, our understanding of life and death transcends completely, and things we consider miracles can happen. The child had to cope with both physical and psychological trauma, but his survival became a symbol of hope and resilience. This tragedy was not just an accident. It was a deep reflection on the meaning of survival and an awareness of the fragility of life. Even years after the Spanair MD-82 crash, its impact continued to be felt in the aviation industry and society. The pain, losses, and questions left by the crash remained at the forefront. Families had lost their loved ones, and their lives had changed forever. The void caused by the crash was not only related to the lost individuals, but also to a deep concern within society regarding safety and security. While the aviation industry was reshaped with the lessons learned from the crash, the effects and remembrance of the event always served as a reminder. Flight safety and maintenance procedures were taken much more seriously after the crash, and significant efforts were made to prevent such tragedies. At the same time, this crash highlighted how precious life is and how quickly life can change. People became more cautious about valuing every moment and showing more appreciation for their loved ones. The memories of those lost in the crash continued to be remembered as a symbol of the child's survival. The significance of this crash remained not just as a plane crash, but as a story that demonstrated the fragility of life and death. As a result, the Spanair MD-82 crash became not just a catastrophe, but an event that left important lessons and questions in people's minds. The measures and security improvements taken after the crash increased aviation safety, but the pain and losses left behind will never be erased. This tragedy continues to serve as a profound reminder of how valuable life is, how crucial safety is, and how a person's fight for survival can sometimes unfold in unexpected ways.